On October 26th, the Russian Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, began crowing from the rooftops. Russia had encircled the key city of Pokrovsk, he claimed, and 31 Ukrainian battalions were surrounded. It would only be a matter of time before the city fell and Ukraine suffered one of its most damaging defeats since Vladimir Putin's invasion began. Ukraine had until October 27th to leave Pokrovsk or its forces would be destroyed, Gerasimov declared. It's over 2 weeks later and Pokrovsk hasn't fallen yet. Instead, the city is costing Putin everything. As Russia claims to be on the verge of victory, it's suffering massive troop losses that lead to shortages elsewhere on the front lines. Putin wants Pokrovsk at all costs. What he doesn't realize is that he may be sacrificing Russia's chances in Ukraine to get it. On November 12th, the Kyiv Post published a report revealing that Russian soldiers are dying in such massive numbers during the Pokrovsk offensive that the country is running out of troops to send. To solve the problem, the outlet says, Russia is urgently redeploying troops from other areas of Ukraine to make up for the Pokrovsk shortfall. This is a short-sighted move as it opens up opportunities for Ukraine's forces outside of the city to launch counterattacks and retake territory. But that doesn't matter to Putin. He needs to capture Pokrovsk, and he doesn't care about the cost. The intelligence behind the Kyiv Post report comes from the Atesh resistance movement, which took to Telegram to report that it's seen Russian military convoys flooding toward Pokrovsk. Those convoys from other regions of Ukraine are packed with soldiers and equipment. Specifically, these resources are being pulled from the Zaporizhia and Kherson fronts, both of which are now significantly weakened on the Russian end. The Russian army has apparently exhausted both its main forces and operational reserves to continue the offensive, so they're being forced to urgently expose other sections of the front, Atesh claimed in its November 12th Telegram report. It also revealed that Russia is in such a rush to get its transferred soldiers into the combat lines in Pokrovsk that it's skipping a key step once they arrive. Agents from the 506th Motorized Rifle Regiment report that hundreds of troops are arriving at their location every day. New arrivals from other units are immediately sent into the assault, sometimes without even being assigned to the new regiment. On the one hand, this is clearly Putin using his attritional strategy. A constant flood of manpower will eventually break Ukraine's Pokrovsk defenses, no matter how strong those defenses may be. But on the other hand, Putin is showcasing a remarkable lack of foresight as he sends soldiers to almost certain death, even though he needs to hold on to territory in Zaporizhia and Kherson. For many of these soldiers, the journey to Pokrovsk is a one-way trip. They won't be coming back to defend the occupied territories that Putin has just made more vulnerable. United 24 media agrees with this viewpoint, as it quotes an Atesh source claiming that Russia keeps sending fresh forces to certain death. Morale among these new arrivals is extremely low, which is also affecting Putin's Pokrovsk push. Already strained beyond recognition, Russia's military capacity is starting to creak at the seams, and soldiers who may have once been stationed in occupied regions they thought were somewhat safe are being sent to confront Ukraine's drones, artillery, and other fortifications. Putin is weakening Russia elsewhere in Ukraine for a reason. During the week before the Kyiv Post's November 12th report, Russia launched 132 assaults against Pokrovsk alone. That represents a 20% increase over the assault numbers from the week prior, and it shows us that Putin believes that Russia is getting close to completing what he sees as a final push for Pokrovsk. However, these assaults aren't as successful as Russia needs them to be. Despite its claims of encirclement, Russia's forces are being blocked from every attempt they make to capture key buildings and infrastructure in Pokrovsk, the Kyiv Post reports. Ukraine has placed a particular focus on keeping Russia's forces out of high-rise buildings, thus depriving them of strategic vantage points. Russia's forces are getting into Pokrovsk, but once they're in, they're blind. Ukraine is taking advantage of this fact to clear the occupying forces quickly so its defenders are ready for the next waves. As intense as Russia's Pokrovsk assaults have become, those assaults aren't making much progress. Russia is primarily focused on northern Pokrovsk, which is the industrial hub of the city. However, the Kyiv Post says that Ukraine still controls all of the key access routes in the northern region, which is limiting the number of reinforcements that Russia can send. Even when pulling troops from other fronts, Russia is still having to send them into Pokrovsk as part of small units that make very little progress. Russia is also trying to push toward Rashin, which is to the northwest of Pokrovsk, though it's stalling out there as well. Russia is struggling more than many realize in Pokrovsk. It's caught between trying to launch more intense assaults and dealing with a shortage of soldiers for those assaults, which have made it pull from elsewhere in Ukraine. Putin's single-minded focus on taking Pokrovsk at all costs may eventually work, but he'll have bled his military dry in the process. That might still work out for Putin. We'll explain why later in the video. More pressing at the moment is the implication that Russia is running out of soldiers in Pokrovsk, which is forcing it to bring reserves into the region. Bear in mind that Russia has already sent plenty of soldiers to the Pokrovsk front. When Putin launched Russia's vaunted summer offensive in May, he did so with the express goal of taking Pokrovsk by the end of August. So determined was he to reach this goal that he dedicated over 100,000 soldiers to the cause, CNN reported toward the end of June. That's a lot of soldiers, yet Russia clearly needs more. And it's not just the soldiers it had dedicated to other areas of Ukraine that are now being sent to the Pokrovsk meat grinder by Putin. As United 24 media reported on November 12th, Russia is attempting to bulk up its numbers in Ukraine by sending over soldiers that were never meant to be in Ukraine in the first place. Russia is sending draft officers into Ukraine. Specifically, those draft officers are being punished for their failure to hit their recruitment quotas, United 24 media reports. It says that these officials, who are usually officers or sergeants, typically serve in the regions where recruitment is low. The Republic of Sakha, which is also known as Yakutia, is a good example. There, the outlet claims the heads of 7 enlistment officers have been booted to the front lines and are now serving in Russia's 5th, 29th, and 35th armies. This information hasn't been pulled from thin air. United 24 media says that Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, or HUR, has been tracking the movements of these unfortunate recruitment officers, and it's confirmed that Putin is meting out his punishment for their failures to recruit at the numbers that Russia needs. In its announcement about Russia's new approach, it points out that recruitment officers in Yakutia fall below their targets by an average of 40%, explaining why they are among the first to be punished. However, what Putin may see as a punishment is actually an unintended drawing back of the curtain that reveals how dire Russia's manpower situation is. Recruiters are sent to the front lines in areas where there is either not enough male population to meet established standards, or where it's impossible to conduct a recruiting campaign within the established timeframe, HUR states. This indicates the Kremlin's complete unawareness of the state of affairs in the regions under its control and the urgent need to replenish losses. The implication here is that Putin has lost the plot. He's setting unrealistic targets and punishing those assigned to meet those targets when they inevitably fail. Of course, this also means that Putin is sending experienced recruiters to die in Ukraine. Those who replace these punished officers are going to have an even harder time hitting Putin's numbers, leading to them being punished too. And so it will keep going, with Russia sacrificing soldiers who have particular talents once again to the meat assaults in Pokrovsk and elsewhere. There's another interesting wrinkle to this part of the story. The recruiters in line for Putin's punishment typically operate in Russia's far-flung regions. While HUR notes that Putin seems to be losing control of these regions now, they have previously been a massive source of manpower for the Ukraine war. As the Wilson Center noted back in March, Putin prefers to recruit his soldiers from the poorest and most remote regions of Russia. He is disproportionately pulled from the populations of indigenous peoples in Russia, the center claims. And it has the numbers to prove it, using the Buryat community as an example. According to Alexandra Gamazapova, president of the Free Buryatia Foundation, at least 2,470 Buryatia residents have been killed in action since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the outlet claims. In a republic with a population of only 980,000, of which 30% are Buryat, this translates to 252 combat deaths per 100,000 residents. For comparison, the number of Muscovites killed in action is estimated at 1,215 in a city of 13.2 million. This translates to 9.2 combat deaths for 100,000 residents. There's a clear bias at play here. Putin prefers to send the impoverished and the far-flung into Ukraine because doing so means that he keeps the demands of the war he started away from Russia's more important cities. Why does that matter? As the struggles of the recruitment officers in Yakutia prove, Russia's source of impoverished soldiers who can be cajoled or bribed into service with massive contracts is running low. The well is almost dry, and that means Putin will soon have to start recruiting from cities that haven't been impacted by the war anywhere near as much as Russia's poorer regions. Reserves and recruiters being sent to the front lines, along with the failures to hit quotas that led to the punishment of the latter, all show us that Russia's military recruitment situation isn't exactly rosy. Compounding that issue is that Russia's financial situation may also mean the country can't keep pace with its recruiting ambitions. Back in April, the New York Post spoke to George Barros, who is the Russia team lead at the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW. Barros revealed that Russia had already burned through about half of its $106 billion in liquid reserves, which it's been using to fund the war. Assuming Russia tries to keep pumping soldiers into Ukraine at a high pace, which the increased assaults in Pokrovsk show that it is, Russia may have only had between 12 and 16 months' worth of money to afford its soldiers back in April. We're in November now. At best, if Barros is correct, Russia only has about a year of funds left. The system for generating fighters worked for 2.5 years, but it's starting to fail, Barros told the New York Post. Russia is constrained by the laws of economics, scarce resources, and there isn't an endless manpower resource in Russia. If Russia is also having to hire soldiers from more prosperous regions of the country than it has in the past, as the falling recruitment numbers in its more remote regions indicate it has to, then Putin may even have to offer more money in soldier contracts than he currently does to get more affluent Russians onto the front lines. Whether it's a manpower or financial shortage, Russia is struggling to get enough people into Pokrovsk. However, as we said earlier, Putin wants Pokrovsk, and he doesn't care how much Russia loses in the process of capturing the city. As RBC Ukraine notes, Russia has already exhausted its main forces and a lot of its operational reserves in the Pokrovsk direction, and that's taken Russia to the verge of capturing the city. Though reports of complete encirclement appear to be premature, CNN said on November 8th that Russia is poised to take Pokrovsk after 21 months of brutal fighting. At this point, it seems to be a case of how much longer Ukraine can hold out, rather than how it will repel Putin's forces entirely. But why? Why is Putin so willing to hurt Russia's positions elsewhere to push through in Pokrovsk? Earlier we mentioned that Putin's approach of trying to take Pokrovsk at all costs might end up working out for him in the end, even with the sheer scale of loss that Russia has experienced. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky reveals why when talking about the situation in Pokrovsk and what it really means in the wider context of the war. On November 7th, Zelensky held a media briefing in which he explained that the push for Pokrovsk has ramifications that extend beyond the city itself, and even the Donetsk region that Putin believes that Russia can take if it captures Pokrovsk. It all comes down to both the peace discussions that have stopped and started throughout 2025, along with Putin's fear of increased US pressure. Putin is trying to promote the narrative that they can allegedly take Donbass and to call on Western countries to force Ukraine to give Donbass to Russia, Zelensky said on November 7th. He added, "It can affect the push for sanctions or the delay of sanctions. Russia is very afraid of strong US decisions, and with this story about Pokrovsk, they want to show success on the battlefield." This idea that Pokrovsk will give Putin leverage is what has led Russia's leader to try to take the city at all costs. And wouldn't you just know it, Putin is trying to play the Pokrovsk card, even though the city hasn't fallen and Russia's troop situation has become dire. On November 12th, Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty reported that the word out of Russia is that Putin is ready to resume peace talks with Ukraine as the battle for Pokrovsk rages. That claim comes in the wake of a backdoor effort by the UK to reopen a dialogue, which fell flat because Russia is unwilling to compromise on any of the demands it's made for peace. Putin's mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov was quick to reveal that the UK had tried to start a discussion, stating there were indeed contacts, but the talks quickly collapsed because there was a lack of any intention or desire to listen to opposition. Given the impossibility of exchanging views, the mutual dialogue has not developed. Now Russia is ready to resume talks with Ukraine in Istanbul. For the time being, Kyiv has put the negotiations on pause. Turkish officials have repeatedly called on them to resume those. The Russian team of negotiators is ready for that, and the ball is in Ukraine's court, a senior Russian diplomat told the Russian news agency TASS on November 12th. It's clear to see what's happening here. Putin is confident in success at Pokrovsk, despite Russia's losses, and he thinks he can strike while the iron is hot by putting pressure on Ukraine to acquiesce. But he's wrong for two reasons. The first is that the taking of Pokrovsk may not be as big a coup for Russia as Putin has led the West to believe. The Independent's World Affairs editor Sam Kiley made that point in a November 11th piece, where he pointed out that Russia will take more than a century to capture all of Ukraine if it continues at the pace we've seen so far during the war. And even if Pokrovsk falls, Kiley says, there will be nothing left of the garrison town for Russia to defend or exploit. Beyond that, a veritable hellscape awaits the Russian forces that will attempt to push deeper into Ukraine from Pokrovsk. The landscape behind the Ukrainian front lines has been prepared for a fighting retreat by key forces. Thousands of miles of trenches, barriers, tank traps, and barbed wire mazes have been laid, Kiley writes. No doubt secret minefields, stay-behind bunkers for behind-the-lines operations, and meticulously calibrated targeting will make Russia's next phase another session in the meat grinder of Ukraine's eastern front. Putin sees the capture of Pokrovsk as a potential endpoint, which is why he's throwing everything he has at the city. Ukraine sees that city's fall as the trigger for an even bigger Russian bloodbath in the Donbass. Speaking of bloodbaths, that brings us to the second reason why a Russian capture of Pokrovsk might not mean as much as Putin hopes it will. Should the city fall, the number of soldiers that Russia has lost and will go on to lose in Pokrovsk's capture will come back to haunt it. We're already seeing that with Russia being forced to call on soldiers from elsewhere in occupied Ukraine to maintain its Pokrovsk offensive. However, the scale of loss already experienced in that city can't be underestimated. The Kyiv Post points out that Ukraine exacted a heavy toll on Russia's Pokrovsk forces in the week before the revelation that soldiers are being pulled into the region from elsewhere. The previous 7 days have seen Ukraine kill 236 Russian soldiers and wound a further 136. That's bad enough news in its own right, especially because it shows that Russia is dealing with more deaths than injuries in its push for Pokrovsk. These dead soldiers need to be replaced, both now and when Russia tries to push beyond Pokrovsk into the fortified hellscape that Kylie says awaits them. In addition to these troop losses, Russia has also lost a tank, a trio of armored vehicles, and 23 other vehicles, such as bikes and trucks, over the past 7 days. Taking a wider view of the entirety of 2025, David Axe says in his Trench Arc column that Russia has lost 100,000 soldiers to death or injury in the Pokrovsk direction during the year. That was back on October 6th. Another month of fighting will have added several thousand more to that figure. This is the problem with Putin's approach of taking Pokrovsk at all costs. Yes, it seems inevitable the city will fall, though it may be weeks or even months before that happens. As Ukraine continues to defend, Russia will lose many more soldiers at a time when it's already yanking soldiers from the front lines elsewhere to fight in Pokrovsk. Russian military recruitment is struggling, as we see from the punishments being meted out to recruitment officers who don't meet their quotas. And as he tries to use Pokrovsk as leverage against Ukraine in the West, Putin has failed to answer a key question: what comes after Pokrovsk? Russia may want the West to think that the rest of Donetsk will fall after Pokrovsk, but the reality is that an entire fortified belt of other cities and territories awaits the exhausted and battered Russian forces, assuming those forces can take Pokrovsk. Leverage can't exist when the army that underpins it has been destroyed. Putin may find that out if and when Pokrovsk falls. The strategy Russia's leader implemented may have even led to more losses in Pokrovsk than we've already revealed in this video. October in particular has been a month from hell for Russia, as its colossal losses in that month alone amount to 25,000 soldiers. No wonder Putin is having to call on any troops he can find to keep the Pokrovsk assault going. Find out more about these losses and the role that Ukraine's FPV drones had in causing them in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the Pokrovsk situation. And thank you as always for watching.